This is my true story. After my wife passed, my only hope was my daughter. I thought she would be my family, my comfort, my reason to keep going. But one evening at a family dinner, my own daughter looked me in the eye and said, "You're just a burden." The room went quiet. I smiled faintly, nodded, and said nothing. But inside, something broke. I knew things would never be the same. A week later, I made sure she'd never see me, or the life she expected again. But before I tell you what I did which shocked her, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there. And please subscribe so more people hear my story. I was never meant to raise a child alone, but life doesn't always ask you what you're ready for. When my wife passed away, it felt like someone had taken the world I knew and smashed it into 1,000 pieces. I remember holding my little girl's hand at the funeral, her fingers so small and warm in mine, and thinking, I don't know how to do this, but I'll do it anyway. She was just 7 years old, too young to understand the full weight of what we had lost, but old enough to know something in our home would never be the same again. And so I became both father and mother, learning to braid hair in the mornings before school and to make dinners out of whatever was left in the pantry when payday was still far away. I took the first job I could find after my wife's death, and then the second, because the first one didn't pay enough to keep us in our small house. During the day, I worked in a cold, noisy factory, the smell of oil and steel clinging to my clothes. At night, I took odd jobs, repairing fences, delivering groceries, even cleaning out sheds for neighbors who couldn't be bothered to do it themselves. My hands were always sore. My back ached constantly. But every time I saw my daughter sleeping peacefully, her small chest rising and falling under the blanket, I told myself it was worth it. I missed school plays because I was working. I missed weekends because I needed the extra shift. But I never missed the important moments, the times when she needed me to be there. When she got sick in the middle of the night, I sat by her bed until the fever broke. When she had nightmares, I carried her into my room so she could fall asleep beside me. She didn't have her mother anymore, but I swore she'd never feel like she had less love. Every decision I made was with her future in mind. I gave up things I didn't even realize were dreams. I had once thought I might open my own workshop, maybe even travel a bit when I was older. But instead, my savings went toward her school trips, new clothes so she wouldn't feel embarrassed next to her classmates, and later, college tuition so she could get the education I never had. I didn't want her to just survive. I wanted her to thrive. When she graduated, I sat in the audience with tears in my eyes. All those years of exhaustion and sacrifice felt lighter in that moment. She was stepping into a world full of possibility, and I thought to myself, I've done my job right. I paid for her wedding when she met the man she wanted to marry. I gave her and her husband the down payment for their first house, writing the check without hesitation. It didn't matter that I would have to tighten my own belt for years after. She was my daughter, and I believed that helping her build her life was the best thing I could ever do. Over the years, I became her safety net in ways I didn't even think about. When her car broke down, I covered the repairs. When she wanted to start a small side business, I invested in it. If she needed someone to watch her children, I was there without question. I thought, foolishly, perhaps, that love and loyalty worked like a circle. You give, and eventually it comes back to you when you need it. I never once asked her to pay me back for any of it, because the return I wanted wasn't money. I just wanted to know she respected me, that she saw me not just as her father, but as the man who had stood between her and the world when she was too small to stand alone. But looking back now, I see that maybe I trained her to see me differently. I made it too easy for her to take. Too easy for her to see my giving as something endless, like a well that would never run dry. I didn't realize it then, but every time I said yes without hesitation, I might have been teaching her that I would always be there, not because she loved me, but because I didn't know how to stop sacrificing. People talk about unconditional love like it's the highest virtue a parent can have, and in many ways, I believed in it. I told myself that even if she never said thank you, Even if she never repaid me, it was enough to see her happy. But there's something dangerous about always giving without ever asking whether the person receiving truly values it. Because over time, that love can turn into something else, an expectation. And once love turns into an expectation, the respect that should come with it begins to fade. In those years, I thought we were still close. I thought she understood, deep down, what I had done for her. If you had asked me then whether my daughter would ever treat me with cruelty, I would have laughed in your face. We had been through too much together. She knew how hard I had fought for her future. She had seen me come home late, covered in sweat and dust, just to make sure she had everything she needed. In my mind, those memories bound us together for life. But bonds can be weaker than you think. And love, if it's not nurtured with mutual respect, can turn cold without warning. I didn't know it yet, but all those years of being her safety net had made me invisible in a way. I was not her father who had given up his dreams for her. I was just the man who always said yes when she asked for something. I was not a person to her anymore, not in the way I had once been. I was a provider, a resource, a fixture in her life that she assumed would always be there. And because of that, I never saw the change coming. The first signs that something had shifted between us were so small that I almost convinced myself I imagined them. After her marriage, the visits started to feel different. When she was younger, she'd come over with that bright energy, telling me about her day or asking for my advice. But now, whenever she came, there was a kind of hurried air about her, as though she had somewhere more important to be. She'd sit for a little while, check her phone often, and then say, "I should get going, Dad. We've got plans tonight." I told myself it was just part of her building her own life. People grow, routines change. But a little piece of me missed the way she used to linger. Calls became less frequent too. At first, she'd still ring me a couple of times a week, even if it was just to tell me something funny the kids had said. But slowly, it dwindled. Weeks would pass before I'd hear her voice. And when the phone did ring, it was almost always for a reason. And that reason usually had a price tag. She'd start with polite small talk, but I could always hear that subtle hesitation before she got to the real point. "Dad, could you help us out with..." Maybe the water heater broke. Maybe the car needed new tires. Sometimes it was just a little extra money to get them through a tough month. And of course, I said yes. Every time. I never wanted her to feel like I wasn't there for her. But it didn't escape me that we didn't talk much unless she needed something. Those quiet evenings where she'd drop by unannounced just to have a cup of tea with me seemed to have disappeared. It was as if our relationship was shifting from father and daughter to lender and borrower. Except I was the kind of lender who never expected anything back. Then the hints began. Little comments here and there, ones I brushed off at the time, but which stayed with me long after. She'd say things like, "You know, Dad, you should think about downsizing. A smaller place would be easier for you to manage." Or, "Maybe you should sell some of your things. You don't really use them anymore." She said them with a smile, almost like suggestions for my own benefit. But there was something behind her tone I couldn't quite place. It wasn't concern in the way a daughter worries for her father's comfort. It felt more like she was gently pushing me towards something she had already decided for me. I remember one Sunday lunch at her house. She had invited me over, which was becoming rare. And as I sat at the table, she and her husband exchanged glances when the conversation turned to my finances. I had mentioned paying my property taxes, and she laughed lightly, saying, "You won't have to worry about those forever, Dad. One day you'll be free of all that." She said it so casually, but it lodged in my mind. It wasn't the kind of freedom you hope for. It was the kind that comes when someone else takes over everything you own. There were other small moments, too. I'd offer to help around her house, fixing a door, trimming the garden. But she'd say, "Oh, don't bother, we'll get someone in." At first, I thought she just didn't want to trouble me. But gradually, it dawned on me that she didn't see me as capable anymore. Not as the man who had built and repaired and provided for decades, but as someone who might just make a mess of things. That stung more than I admitted, even to myself. and there was a certain impatience in her now. When we spoke, she sometimes cut me off mid-sentence, finishing my thoughts for me as though I were too slow. She started using that tone, the one people use when speaking to someone they think can't keep up. I still remember one time I was telling her about a news article I'd read, and she sighed, looking at her phone, and said, Yeah, I've seen it already." I laughed it off in the moment, but inside I felt a pang I couldn't quite shake. Looking back, I think these were the cracks forming in the wall that had held our relationship steady all these years. They were hairline fractures at first, barely visible unless you looked closely. But I see now that each small dismissal, each time she treated me as less than the man who raised her, was another tiny blow weakening the structure. I told myself over and over that I was imagining things, that she still loved me the same, that maybe she was just stressed or distracted. But the truth is, love isn't just in the big gestures. It's in the everyday respect, the small acts of kindness, the willingness to truly listen. And those were fading. I should have spoken up. I should have told her that her words and silences hurt me. But I didn't. Partly because I didn't want to start an argument. Partly because I didn't want to believe the little voice in my head whispering that she was changing, and partly because I hoped, that she would come back around on her own. But instead, the space between us grew. I became more of a shadow in her life, someone she could call when she needed something but didn't otherwise think much about. And I accepted it because I thought that's what love meant, enduring the distance without complaint, waiting for the warmth to return. What I didn't know then was that the warmth wouldn't return. The cracks would widen, and soon, one moment, just a few cruel words, would bring the whole wall crashing down. It happened on a Sunday evening, one of those family dinners where everyone comes together under one roof. I hadn't been over to her house in a while, so I was glad when she invited me. I thought maybe things were getting better, that maybe the distance between us was finally closing. I even stopped on the way to pick up her favorite dessert from the bakery she loved as a child, an old habit of mine, something I used to do when she was little and I came home from work. When I walked in, I could tell right away she wasn't expecting me to stay long. She greeted me with a quick smile, but her eyes went back to her phone almost instantly. The house was lively, kids running around, her husband in the kitchen, voices overlapping in the way family dinners often are. I tried to blend into the background, taking a seat at the table and chatting with the grandkids. At one point during the evening, I noticed the sink was full of dishes and the tap was dripping. I've always been the kind of man who can't stand to see something broken in a home. It's not about being a hero, it's just the way I've been my whole life. So I went over, rolled up my sleeves, and started tightening the faucet. I thought she'd appreciate it, but instead, she sighed. Loudly, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. It stopped me in my tracks. I turned to look at her, and she was standing there with her arms crossed, shaking her head. "Dad," she said, her voice sharp, "you don't have to mess with everything. You're always trying to fix things, and honestly, you're just a burden, always needing something or getting in the way." The room went quiet. Her husband looked down. The kids didn't understand, but they stopped running for a moment. I felt the weight of her words hit me like a blow to the chest. I didn't move, didn't speak. I just stood there holding the wrench, my hands trembling slightly. It wasn't the first time she'd said something that stung. But this was different. This was direct. Cold. It wasn't dressed up as a joke or hidden behind polite language. She called me a burden, not just in front of her family, but in front of mine. And in that moment, something inside me shifted, not in anger, but in clarity. I realized that all the sacrifices, the years of hard work, the sleepless nights when she was sick, the money I poured into her dreams, none of it mattered to her now. In her eyes, I had gone from father to inconvenience. I nodded slowly, set the wrench down by the sink, and walked back to my chair. I forced myself to finish the meal without saying a word about it. I laughed when it was appropriate, answered questions when asked, and even thanked her for having me over. But inside, a storm was gathering. On the drive home that night, her words replayed in my head over and over. "You're just a burden." Each time, it cut a little deeper. I tried to remind myself that maybe she didn't mean it. Maybe she was stressed. Maybe she was just having a bad day. But the truth was, you don't say something like that unless you've thought it before. And she had thought it. I could see it in her face when she said it. There was no hesitation, no regret. It came out too easily. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I knew something had changed for good. I went into my study, sat in the old leather chair I'd had for decades, and stared at the bookshelf across from me. It was filled with photo albums, each one telling the story of a life I thought I'd built with love and loyalty. I saw her first steps, her graduation day, her wedding. I remembered every dollar I scraped together so she could go to college without debt, every meal I skipped so she could eat more when money was tight, every gift I bought her just to see her smile. And now, all of that, in her mind, was outweighed by the fact that I was still here, still breathing, still taking up space in her world. I stayed in that chair for hours, long after the house went dark. I didn't cry, not because I didn't want to, but because the hurt sat so deep it was beyond tears. I thought about confronting her, telling her exactly what her words had done to me. But then another thought settled in, heavier and colder than the rest. If she already saw me as a burden, then explaining myself wouldn't change anything. Her mind was made up. So instead, I decided something else. That moment, those words, would be the last time she ever had the power to make me feel small. I wouldn't argue. I wouldn't beg for her respect. I wouldn't try to prove my worth. I would let her believe I was walking away quietly, but I wouldn't be leaving empty-handed. I went to bed that night with a plan beginning to form, one that would take her by complete surprise. It wasn't about revenge in the loud, dramatic sense. It was about reminding her of something she had clearly forgotten. Everything she wanted for her future was still in my hands. And if I was truly a burden in her eyes, then I was going to lift myself off her shoulders completely, along with everything she had been counting on inheriting. It was the kind of decision you don't say out loud, the kind you make in silence, because silence has a way of being far more powerful than any argument. She had made her position clear. Now, it was time for me to make mine. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my study with the lamp on, the yellow light spilling over stacks of old photo albums, boxes of letters, and little keepsakes I had collected over the years. My hands wandered over them without thinking. A ribbon from her first school play, a seashell she brought me from a class trip, a Father's Day card she made when she was 7. All these years, I kept them safe. I never threw away a single thing she gave me. I thought about my late wife, her mother, and how she would have reacted if she were still alive. She wouldn't have believed it. She loved that girl more than anything, and she used to tell me, "One day, she'll take care of you the way you've taken care of her." I held on to that hope for decades. Every sacrifice I made with that promise in mind. I never expected luxury in my old age, but I did expect kindness. I thought I had earned that much. Her words from dinner, "You're a burden," echoed in my head. The more I replayed them, the more I realized they weren't just a slip of the tongue. They were the truth she had been carrying for a while. I began remembering little things that I had brushed off before. The sigh when I asked her for a ride to the doctor, the way her voice tightened when I stayed over too long, the comments about making space and downsizing. They were all pieces of the same puzzle, and I had been too blind to put them together. I poured myself a glass of water and sat back down, staring at the wall. For the first time, I let myself ask the question I'd been avoiding. Was I really a burden? Not just to her, but to the world? I was getting older. My knees ached, my back wasn't what it used to be, and sometimes I did need help. But being a burden isn't about needing help. It's about how the people around you see that need. And in her eyes, my needs were too heavy. The thought made my chest tighten. I could almost feel a thread snapping, the invisible line that had tied us together as father and daughter. It had been fraying for years, and now it was gone. I stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the street was quiet. The only sound was the ticking of the old clock on the wall. I thought about all the times I had driven across town in the middle of the night when she called in trouble. The time I emptied my savings to help her cover a mortgage payment. The time I skipped paying my own bills so she could start her business. I never once called her a burden. I never once counted the cost. And now, here I was, being counted as one. I sat back down at my desk and opened a drawer. Inside was a small metal box, my important papers box. Wills, property deeds, bank statements, stock certificates, investment documents. As I thumbed through them, I realized something she seemed to have forgotten. Almost everything she wanted after I was gone was still mine right now. 3 properties, including the lake cabin she loved. My antique car collection, which she had told her friends she would one day inherit. Even certain bank accounts and trust funds that she thought were already hers were still under my name. And for the first time since her words cut me, I felt something other than sadness. I felt control, not petty revenge, not rage, but control, the kind I had forgotten I still had. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. I thought about what would happen if I left things the way they were. If I let her keep believing she would have these things someday. She would go on living her life with the comfort of that safety net. She would never truly face what it means to build without someone else's foundation. And I thought, maybe it's time she learned. I pictured her walking into the lake cabin one summer years from now, only to find strangers living there. I imagined her logging into the bank account she thought was hers and finding it empty. I imagined her realizing that the man she called a burden had been the one holding her future in his hands the entire time. The idea didn't bring me joy exactly, but it brought me peace. I closed the metal box and locked it. I didn't rush. I didn't call anyone. I just sat there, listening to the quiet, and made a decision. This would be the last night I carried the weight of her opinion. The next morning, I would begin to put my plan in motion. When the sun rose the next morning, I was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee and that same metal box of papers in front of me. The more I went through them, the more I realized my daughter had no idea just how much of her future was tied directly to me and how quickly I could change it. Years ago, when she was just starting her life with her new husband, she had dreams bigger than her bank account. She wanted a house with a wide porch, land for a garden, and a place where she could host family dinners. She wanted to start a small shop in town, but she didn't have the money to do it. I did, and I gave it to her, or at least that's what she thought. The truth was, I never gave her anything without a paper trail that kept me connected to it. When I paid for her first house, I didn't just hand over the money. I had my name on the deed alongside hers. She thought it was just for paperwork purposes and didn't think about it again. When she needed funds to open her shop, I didn't just gift her the amount. I invested in it under my own name, making me a silent partner. Even when I helped her and her husband buy land for that farm they bragged about to everyone, I became the co-owner. It wasn't because I didn't trust her back then. It was because life had taught me something. You never throw away the pen that signs the paper. You keep it in your pocket. You stay connected. Over the years, I also built my own little empire. 3 properties, my main home, the lake cabin she loved to visit, and a rental house in town that brought in steady income. I had a collection of antiques that were worth more than some people's retirement funds. I had investments in stocks and bonds that quietly grew in the background. I even had a trust fund that I told her was for her kids one day. And yes, my name was the only one that could move the money. She never asked questions. She assumed all of it was hers by default. She spoke about the cabin as my future summer house and referred to the antiques as family treasures she would take care of one day. She even joked once that she didn't need to worry about retirement because Dad's got it covered, and I had covered it until now. As I sipped my coffee, I thought about the way she had looked at me across that dinner table when she called me a burden. It wasn't just the words. It was the lack of hesitation, the sharpness in her tone, the way she didn't flinch after saying it. It told me that in her mind, I was no longer the man who had raised her, worked for her, or sacrificed for her. I was an inconvenience. But she had forgotten something important. I was an inconvenience she still needed. The power wasn't in my words. It wasn't in confronting her or trying to change her mind. The power was in the paper, the deeds, the accounts, the titles. Those were the strings holding her comfortable future together, and my hands were still wrapped around them. I remembered a conversation from years ago when she was nervous about getting a business loan. She had asked me, "Dad, why do you always keep your name on things? Don't you trust me?" I laughed then, told her it was just habit, just good business sense. But the truth was, I kept my name there because trust is not the same as blind surrender. I trusted her, but I also knew people change, circumstances change, and one day, I might need to protect myself. That day had come. I began making a mental list of everything that could be sold, transferred, or liquidated within a week. The lake cabin? Easy. There were buyers who had been asking about it for years. The rental house? A quick private sale would do. The antiques? I knew a dealer who could move them in days. My stocks and bonds? All I had to do was make a few calls to my broker. Even her shop, the one she ran with such pride, could be sold because on paper, it wasn't just hers. Every document in that box was a reminder that she had mistaken my generosity for surrender. She thought kindness meant weakness. She thought the things I provided would always be hers to claim. She thought I would never walk away. But I was no longer the father who would bend until he broke just to keep her happy. I was the man who had heard the truth in her voice, and once you hear something like that, you can't unhear it. I looked out the window at the street, watching neighbors leave for work. I wondered what they would say if they knew that in just a matter of days, everything my daughter relied on would be gone from her grasp. Some might call it cruel. Others might call it justice. To me, it was neither. It was balance. It was setting the scales right after they had been tipped for too long. I put the lid back on the metal box and locked it. The decision was made. The plan would be quiet, clean, and final. There would be no yelling, no dramatic scenes. I wouldn't give her the satisfaction of knowing she had hurt me so deeply that I had to strike back. I would simply vanish from her life and take the future she assumed was guaranteed with me. When you're called a burden, you have two choices. You can try to prove them wrong by begging for their approval, or you can step out of their life entirely and let them feel the weight of losing you. I chose the second. The next morning, I woke before the sun again. This time, it wasn't the weight of sadness that got me out of bed. It was something sharper, more focused. The decision had already been made. Now it was time to move. I didn't tell anyone what I was about to do. Not the neighbors who always waved when I checked the mailbox. Not the old friends at the diner who'd ask me about my daughter and her family. And certainly not her. Silence was my weapon. If she didn't see it coming, she couldn't stop it. The first thing I did was call my lawyer, the same man who had helped me sign the papers for every property, every investment, every gift I'd given her over the years. He knew my history. He knew the way I thought. When I told him I wanted everything moved, sold, and secured within 7 days, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then he simply said, "I'll get started today." We began with the properties. The lake cabin went first. I'd owned it for decades, and it was in my name. My daughter had always called it our summer place, but she had never paid a cent for it. I had 3 private buyers who'd asked about it in the past, and all it took was a few phone calls to set up a deal. By the end of the day, the papers were signed, and the payment was in my account. The rental house in town was next. I'd kept it as a steady source of income, and tenants loved the location. It wasn't hard to find someone willing to pay cash for it. I didn't even have to put up a "for sale" sign. One conversation with a local businessman, and by the next afternoon, It was gone too. Then came the antiques, the things she had been eyeing for years. The dining table from my grandparents, the clock from the old train station, the gold coins I'd collected one by one. I called a dealer I trusted, and he came with a truck and a team. They packed everything with care, wrote me a check on the spot, and drove away. The shelves were bare by nightfall. On the third day, I handled the financial side. The stocks and bonds I'd kept in her future portfolio, sold. The trust fund I'd told her was untouchable, closed. The proceeds were transferred into a secure overseas account she would never have access to. Even the savings account she thought was joint because it had her name on it. I drained it. She hadn't checked the fine print that made me the primary holder. The shop she ran with such pride was more complicated. On paper, she was the face of it, but I had been the one to pay for the property and the inventory. That meant I was legally the owner. My lawyer handled the paperwork quietly, and by the fourth day, a new buyer had taken over. She wouldn't know until she tried to open for business and found her key didn't fit the door. Each night, I returned home to an emptier house. The walls looked bare without the antiques. The shelves had gaps where books and trinkets used to be. But instead of sadness, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: control. I moved like a man who had nothing to lose. My phone was turned off except for calls from my lawyer or the agents handling the sales. I stopped going into town, stopped answering the door. I didn't want anyone asking questions that might get back to her. By the fifth day, almost everything was done. The cabin, the rental house, the antiques, the investments, all gone from her reach. I left the main house for last. Not because I was sentimental, but because it was the final piece of the puzzle. She thought it was hers after I was gone. She didn't know the unpaid loan clauses still gave me full authority to transfer it. That Friday, I signed the papers to put it in my name alone. The house was mine again, free and clear. On the sixth day, I began packing. Not everything, just the essentials. A few changes of clothes, my fishing gear, the photo albums I couldn't leave behind. I left behind the things that no longer mattered. The gifts she had given me out of obligation. The clothes she had bought so I'd look presentable. I didn't want reminders of her pity. The night before I left, I sat in my chair and thought about the man I had been just a week ago. A man who believed his daughter would always see him as the father who gave her everything. A man who thought love was unshakable if it was built over decades. I realized that man was gone. What remained was someone quieter, sharper, and harder to break. 7 days earlier, she had called me a burden. In 7 days, I had taken away everything she thought she would inherit, without lifting a finger to earn it. When the morning of the 7th day came, I didn't feel the need to say goodbye. My plan wasn't about teaching her a lesson she would thank me for later. It wasn't about reconciliation. It was about closing the chapter for good. And tomorrow, the chapter would end. I told myself I wouldn't see her again. I had already decided that silence was the cleanest cut. But on the 7th day, as I looked at the box of family items sitting in the corner of my room, I felt something twist inside me. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't forgiveness. It was the weight of unfinished business. These were pieces of our history: her mother's wedding photo, the quilt her grandmother had made, the carved music box that had once sat on her bedside table. I didn't want them in my possession anymore. They didn't belong to my future. They belonged to the past, and she could keep them if she wanted. I packed them into the box carefully. Each item went in with slow, deliberate movements, not out of nostalgia, but because this was my last act in that role. The giver. When the box was full, I taped it shut and wrote her name across the top. I didn't add a note. There were no explanations left to give. It was early evening when I drove over. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the road. I kept my hands steady on the steering wheel. My heart didn't race. I didn't rehearse what I'd say. There was nothing to rehearse. This wasn't a conversation. It was a delivery. Her house looked the same as always. Perfect lawn, expensive car in the driveway, the kind of place people drive by and admire. I remembered paying the deposit for it, signing the papers, standing next to her while she smiled and thanked me in front of the realtor. That day she'd said, "I'll never forget what you've done for me, Dad." It felt like a different lifetime now, like those words had been spoken to someone else entirely. I knocked on the door once, firmly. She opened it a few moments later, phone in her hand, eyebrows raised like she was already annoyed before she even knew why I was there. "Oh," she said, glancing at the box in my arms. "What's that?" I stepped forward, set the box down in the entryway. "Some things from the house," I said simply. My voice was calm, almost quiet. "You might want them." She didn't bend down to look. She didn't say thank you. She just nodded like I'd left her a bag of groceries instead of decades of family history. Her eyes were still on her phone, thumb moving across the screen. "You busy?" I said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah," she replied, not looking up. I gave a small nod, stepped back toward the door. "Take care," I said, and I meant it, though not in the way she'd think. I meant take care of your own life now. Take care of your own future. Take care, because no one else will. She didn't answer. Didn't even glance up as I walked down the steps. As I got into my truck, I noticed the neighbor across the street watching from his porch. He gave me a polite wave, the same one he'd probably given me a dozen times before. This time, I didn't wave back. That life, the life where I was just her dad in the nice truck visiting his daughter, was over. Driving away, I didn't look in the rearview mirror, not once. I didn't want the last image of her to be framed by that glass, shrinking smaller and smaller. I wanted it gone completely. Halfway home, I stopped the truck on the side of the road and sat there for a moment with the engine running. I thought about how this visit had felt. I had expected maybe a flicker of emotion, maybe one memory that would make my hands shake or my chest ache. But there was nothing. Just a clean emptiness, like closing a drawer that had been stuck for years. It struck me then. The visit hadn't been for her. It had been for me. To see her one last time and realize there was nothing left worth holding on to. To confirm, without doubt, that the man she saw standing on her porch with that box was not the man she would mourn when he was gone. And that was fine. In fact, it was freeing. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the box of her life was out of mine, and the plan for my own life, my real life, was waiting. My bags were already packed. The lawyer had the final documents ready. All that remained was to leave before dawn, before the town was awake enough to notice I was gone. That night, I didn't check my phone. I didn't care if she opened the box, didn't care if she recognized the quilt or wound the music box and remembered the lullaby it played. If those things stirred anything in her, it would be her burden to carry, not mine. I went to bed early. The house was silent, stripped down to the essentials, just as I wanted it. The final visit was done. There would be no next time. No holiday dinners, no birthday calls, no carefully chosen gifts she'd half smile at. Whatever she had wanted from me was already gone, and soon, so was I. The sun would rise in a few hours, and when it did, I'd be on the road, not running, but walking out of a chapter I'd already finished writing. The alarm rang before the first light touched the windows. I didn't need it. I had been awake for hours, lying there in the stillness, listening to the low hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway. It was the kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own breathing. I got up slowly, moved through the house without turning on the lights. This was not a morning for ceremony. It was a morning for disappearing. My bags were already in the truck. 2 suitcases, one with clothes, one with documents, and a few keepsakes that I chose for me. Not for anyone else. I had packed them days ago, the zippers pulled shut like sealed decisions. On the passenger seat sat a plain envelope addressed to my lawyer, ready to be dropped in the overnight box at his office. Inside was the final signed authorization for every transaction, every sale, every transfer. By the time my daughter would wake up that morning, the gears would already be turning. I walked through each room one last time. Not for nostalgia. I had done enough of that in my life. This was just to make sure I was leaving nothing behind that could be used to tether me here. The walls were bare. The shelves were empty. Even the old armchair by the window, where I had sat for years watching the seasons change, was gone. Sold to a neighbor for cash. The house felt like a shell, stripped of its history. It was perfect. The sky outside was still black as I locked the front door and slid the key into my pocket. I didn't leave it behind. There was something satisfying about keeping it. Not because I'd ever come back, but because it was mine until I decided otherwise. The air was cold and sharp. My breath rose in small clouds as I walked to the truck. When the engine started, the sound seemed louder than usual in the early morning silence. I eased out of the driveway slowly, not wanting the tires to crunch too loudly over the gravel. The street was deserted. Every house I passed was dark, every porch empty. In a way, it felt like the whole world was asleep, unaware that I was erasing myself from it. I drove to the lawyer's office first. The building was locked, of course, but the drop box was there, a steel slot in the wall, waiting. I slid the envelope in, heard it hit the bottom with a soft thud. That sound meant everything was final now. The sales, the transfers, the account closures, all set in motion. No second thoughts, no going back. From there, I didn't head home. I didn't even take the road toward it. Instead, I pointed the truck toward the train station an hour away. The plan had been made carefully. No airport in my town, no direct routes anyone could trace too easily. I'd park the truck in the long-term lot at the station, take the first train to the city, and from there, head straight to the international terminal. By the time anyone thought to look for me, I'd be halfway across the ocean. The drive was long and quiet. I didn't turn on the radio. The silence was cleaner. I thought about how many times I'd made this kind of trip before, visiting her when she was in college, surprising her on her birthday, bringing gifts for her children, always going toward her, always giving. This time was different. This time, every mile was taking me further away, and I welcomed it. At the station, I parked in the far corner of the lot. The sky was beginning to lighten now, a faint blue pushing against the darkness. I carried my bags into the terminal, bought a ticket without hesitation. When the train arrived, I stepped on, found a seat by the window, and watched as the platform slid away. The further the train moved, the lighter I felt. It was as if every mile between me and that town stripped away another layer of weight I'd been carrying for years. By the time we reached the city, I could feel something I hadn't felt in a long time. Calm. Not happiness, not joy. Just a still, quiet calm. At the airport, I went straight to the check-in desk for my flight, one I had booked under my full legal name, no disguises, no tricks. I wasn't hiding, I was leaving. There's a difference. My destination was a small coastal country I'd visited once decades ago, a place where the air smelled like salt and the mornings were slow. I had a small cabin waiting there, paid in full, no ties to anyone. As I waited to board, I pictured my daughter's morning. She would wake up, scroll through her phone, maybe drink her coffee before noticing the email from my lawyer. The subject line would be simple: estate update. She would open it and find the truth. Everything she thought she was waiting to inherit was gone. The properties sold, the accounts closed, the investments liquidated. And me? Unreachable. No address, no phone number, no email. The boarding call came. I stepped onto the plane without looking back. The seat was by the window, and as the engines roared to life, I rested my hand on the armrest and let the vibrations sink into my skin. When the plane lifted off, I didn't glance at the ground falling away beneath me. I already knew I'd never see it again. Hours later, when the plane landed in my new country, I walked down the steps onto the tarmac and felt the warm air hit my face. It was different here. Slower. Gentler. Nobody knew me. Nobody expected anything from me. and for the first time in my life, I didn't owe anyone an explanation. By nightfall, I was in my cabin, unpacking only the essentials. The rest could wait. I opened the small window above the bed and listened to the sound of the ocean in the distance. No phones, no visitors, just the steady rhythm of waves and wind. The disappearance was complete. Not an escape, not a hiding place, just the start of a life that belonged entirely to me. The letter was never meant to be long. I knew that if I tried to explain myself, I would risk softening the blow, and I didn't want that. I wanted every word to be clear, sharp, and final, like a door closing. My lawyer had strict instructions: deliver it in person, place it in her hands, and walk away. No conversation, no lingering. The envelope was thick enough to feel important, but light enough to carry no comfort. I can imagine the moment she received it. She probably didn't answer the door herself. She never did. Maybe her husband opened it, saw the lawyer, and called her over with that edge of suspicion in his voice. She would have appeared in the hallway, phone still in her hand, eyes half focused on whatever screen she had been glued to. She would take the envelope without looking at me, except this time, I wasn't there. That was the first change she'd feel. The handwriting on the front was mine. I wanted her to see it and recognize it instantly, a reminder that I had taken the time to put pen to paper, to address her directly, not as daughter, not as sweetheart, just her name. When she tore it open, the single sheet of paper inside would slide out easily. No creases, no folds. I didn't want anything in it to feel accidental. It began with a single sentence: "If I'm a burden, you should feel lighter now." I could almost hear her scoff at that, a nervous, dismissive sound. But she would keep reading. The next line was heavier. "Everything you expected is gone. The houses, the accounts, the investments, sold, closed, transferred. They were never yours to begin with. Now they never will be." I didn't apologize. I didn't justify. I didn't list the years I worked for those things, the sacrifices I made, or the nights I went without so she could have more. That wasn't the point. The point was that I was removing myself and everything I owned from her world in one clean motion. "You'll have to earn your own future now," the letter continued. "You'll stand on your own without leaning on the man you called a burden. I hope you learn what that word really means." At the bottom, no closing sentiment, no love, Dad, or sincerely. Just my name. My full name. The one she seemed to forget belonged to a man before it belonged to a father. I left no return address, no phone number, no email. There would be no replies, no pleas, no negotiations. The letter was not a conversation. It was a verdict. I imagine her standing there in the kitchen, reading those words, while the coffee sat cooling on the counter. Maybe she read them twice, 3 times, hoping she misunderstood. Maybe she looked at her husband for an answer he couldn't give. Maybe her voice rose, sharp with anger, asking how I could do such a thing. But she would find nothing in those sentences to hold on to. Every word was chosen to cut, not to console. She would call the lawyer, of course. He would answer with the calm professionalism I had paid him for and tell her the truth, that the transactions were legal, final, and irreversible. He would refuse to say where I had gone. He would tell her there was nothing to dispute. Then the panic would set in. The math would start. She would think about the bills, the mortgage, the plans she had already made with money she didn't yet own. She would see the future not as she expected, lined with comfort and inheritance, but as it truly was, uncertain, unpadded, and unpromised. And somewhere in the back of her mind, between the anger and the disbelief, a small voice would have to admit that I had listened to her. She said I was a burden, so I removed myself, completely. Back in my new home, thousands of miles away, I didn't picture her face when she read it. I didn't imagine her tears, if there were any. I didn't wonder if she regretted her words. That was her life to live now. Mine had already moved on. I folded a copy of the letter and placed it in my desk drawer that night. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder. It was the cleanest cut I had ever made in my life, and the only one I never doubted. My new life doesn't have the noise I once thought was necessary. There are no phones ringing with demands, no footsteps pacing outside my door waiting for me to give in. The house I live in now is small, but it's mine in a way nothing else ever was. It sits on the edge of a mountain village where the air is sharp and the mornings come slowly. When I wake, I hear the soft hum of the river that runs below the hill. It's not loud enough to drown out my thoughts, just enough to make them feel lighter. I keep my days simple. In the mornings, I walk to the dock with my fishing rod. The water here is clear, so still you can see the sky in it without a ripple. Sometimes I catch something, sometimes I don't. It doesn't matter. I'm not fishing for food. I'm fishing for silence, for stillness, for the kind of time that belongs to no one but me. Afternoons are for reading. I brought only a small box of books with me. The ones that mattered. Old history, a few novels I've read too many times, and one worn photo album. It's not full of her. It's full of the years before her, the years when my life was built from nothing but hard work and quiet pride. I look at those pictures and remember the man I was before I handed my worth to someone else's opinion. The village doesn't ask questions. People nod when they see me in the market, but no one pries. That's what I wanted. A place where my past doesn't follow me, where I'm not the father who walked away, but simply the man who buys bread on Tuesdays and sits by the river when the sun is low. Some days I wonder if she's tried to find me. Maybe she searched records. Maybe she called everyone we both knew. Maybe she didn't. Either way, it doesn't change the fact that I no longer carry her voice in my ear. The word she used, burden, doesn't echo anymore. Out here, it's just a word, stripped of its power. Money isn't something I think about the way she did. I have enough to eat, enough to keep this roof over my head, enough to live without fear. I've made arrangements so that when I go, what's left will go where it's needed, not to the hands that tried to push me out of my own life. Sometimes, when the sun sets just right, I sit on the porch with a cup of tea and watch the light fade over the mountains. The air turns cold quickly here, and I like that. It makes the world feel honest. No pretending, no false warmth. I don't keep a phone. Letters come to the post office, but few are for me. That's fine. I've learned that peace isn't in being surrounded by people. It's in knowing the people who could hurt you no longer can. I haven't spoken to her since the day I left. I don't plan to. Not out of spite, but out of self-respect. There's a difference. She made her choice with her words. I made mine with my actions. A burden is only heavy if you carry it. I put mine down, and I have no intention of picking it back up.